We have lived to see the day where Pikmin 4, of all things, has outperformed two different Final Fantasy games. Pikmin 4 has, of course, outsold Final Fantasy 16, and it has outsold Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, excuse me. This is hilarious to me, considering I grew up in a period where people love to say that Pikmin was a nothing burger IP and that Nintendo was stupid for making it and the GameCube wasn't competitive with the PS2. In reality, it was the PS2 that was not competitive with the GameCube because Sony was simply paying all of these third-party developers to support the platform. And the third parties have spent the past 20 years desperately trying to maintain that relationship. Even when Nintendo was dominating the industry. This is why we did not see a whole lot of support for the Nintendo DS, the second best-selling platform of all time. This is why we did not see a lot of support for the Wii. In fact, we saw a lot of people desperately trying to pretend the Wii was just a fad. Even as early as 2008, that was the narrative. That real gamers don't play on the Wii. Real gamers play on the PS360, right? Even back then, that was true, and that narrative persisted up until like the PS4 generation, where suddenly the costs were too high, development took too long, and the Nintendo games were too good. And suddenly people were beginning to notice that, like, wow, Pikmin 3 is actually a really good game. Super Mario 3D World is actually a really good game. Wind Waker HD, the game that we said was a disappointment, is actually a good game. Way better than Witcher 3, in spite of being significantly older, right? People were beginning to notice these things. And the industry has been desperately flailing around, trying very, very desperately to get people to stay off of Nintendo hardware, right? This is why we've been seeing nothing but complaints about the Switch, about its power, about like the audience, because we, the Nintendo audience, are not willing to put up with nonsense, right? It's really interesting to see this. Um, the pattern lately when it comes to third party releases on Switch is to put out a game on PS5 and Xbox Series X, pretend that it can't run on Switch, pretend that it isn't possible, pretend that there's some technical issue stopping it from happening, and then release the game like 6 to 12 months later, right? Typically. Sometimes it's longer than that. Like, we're only just now getting Ace Combat 7 in July, right? We're only just now getting One Piece Odyssey, right? Games that absolutely could have run on the Switch day one. Nier Automata is another example, right? Games that absolutely could have run on the Switch day one are only just now coming to the platform. Why? Because third parties desperately want to incentivize people to support the non-Nintendo platforms first. It's getting really ridiculous, actually, because Capcom has ported Resident Evil 4 Remake to iPad, right? A platform that can't even run the game, and yet you're still seeing them doing it. You're still seeing them put a lot of effort into it, and the audience isn't biting at all, right? Because the mobile audience just isn't interested in Resident Evil 4 remake. But the reality is, they still try to do it because they are desperately trying to avoid the situation in which they have to compete with Nintendo games on their own hardware. Because the instant they do that, it's suddenly going to become very, very, very obvious to everyone that Nintendo games are superior, right? Like, it's going to be harder for people to write off titles like Metroid Dread or No More Heroes 3 or Shin Megami Tensei 5. Like, Shin Megami Tensei 5 is interesting, right? Because this game was a Switch exclusive for a long time. And what did we hear, right? All throughout that life cycle. That, like, this game is bad. It's one of the worst Shin Megami Tensei games ever, blah, blah, blah. And then it gets confirmed to be a multi-plat, with the re-release, and everybody starts, like, praising the game and saying how great it is. Like, isn't the double standard kind of amazing? And then we had the No More Heroes 3 situation, right? Where I had people in my comment section trying to tell me that, like, I would support No More Heroes if it came out on a real platform. But it's been out. It was already out on PC at that point. By the time I was talking about like the weird contradictions when it comes to the narrative in regards to that game. The reality is, the gaming industry is extremely biased against Nintendo, right? I just saw like an article from Matt Piscatella arguing that like Nintendo has to go multi-plat to stay competitive. Like the idea is that like kids are going to want to play games on their streaming devices or their iPads or whatever. But the reality is Nintendo hardware is going to stay very desirable. It's going to stay very affordable, right? There is no reason not to own Nintendo hardware, right? The reality is like the consoles are going to remain popular for among people who actually want to play the consoles, right? I do think this is the issue fundamentally is that Nintendo consoles are popular with people who actually like playing video games. However, the vast majority of gaming YouTubers, of gaming journalists especially, do not actually like playing video games, which is why we constantly see this weird attempt at downplaying all these major innovators in the sphere, right? Like to a gamer, right? To a real fan of the medium, like it's really obvious why something like The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom is a big deal, or how good Super Mario Bros. Wonder is, right? Like you can see how much those games innovated on past entries and how much they've changed and evolved. But the narrative very persistently over the past year is that like those games were disappointing, that they underwhelmed people, that they didn't sell all that well, but in reality they did very very well for themselves, this in spite of the attempts at downplaying them. For me personally, like Tears of the Kingdom's life cycle has been interesting because this is a game that was a direct sequel to one of the best games ever in the franchise that took place in the same setting. It's very Majora's Mask in that setting, in that way, where people are trying to complain that it's too similar to the original. But when you actually compare the two, much like Majora's Mask, even though it looks very similar and they have some overlapping elements, the reality is they are completely different games. Right? Comparing Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild is kind of an interesting experience because you realize just how radically different they actually are. Like the narrative that like they're the same, that they haven't changed at all, is just not really based on anything other than superficial claims by fanboys who are just trying to push an agenda. Like it is crazy how much Tears of the Kingdom managed to accomplish. And that fact is becoming more and more clear all the time to casual players. Like those of us who blasted through the game in a couple of weeks, like know how great it is. But I imagine, like for general audiences, they've spent the past year playing it, and with how quality the game, with how high quality the game is, and how much stuff there is to do in it, like people will be playing this game for a very, 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 very long time, as opposed to something like Helldivers 2, which or Pow World, which was dropped within a couple of weeks. Right. The reality is the narrative that Nintendo cannot stay competitive with the rest of the industry is simply not true. It's it's interesting seeing how the narrative this year has been that Nintendo has had a slow year, but we've already seen them write off and ignore all the great games that have come out already, right? Unicorn Overlord and Princess Peach Showtime specifically, but like they're also going to write off Endless Ocean 3. They're also going to write off like The Thousand Year Door and Luigi's Mansion 2 Dark Moon. Like they're going to do everything they possibly can to ignore and downplay all of these great games. In reality, I think it's safe to say that The Thousand Year Door is better than modern RPGs. I think it's safe to say that Dark Moon is going to find a new audience of fans, and YouTubers are not going to be able to damage control the game the way they did when it first came out. I think Nintendo is going to have a really good second half of the year. I think we're going to see some really cool things in the next couple of months. But no, right now, all anybody's doing is trying to gaslight you and trick you into thinking Nintendo is on its way out from the console industry.